It's no secret that the very institutions which help define human rights have members who abuse them and are working to redefine the term human rights to meet their own ends. The actions of China and Russia have too often prevented the UN Security Council from being an effective body in addressing atrocities around the world, as we've seen again and again in Syria. These are real concerns with the United Nations and other international organizations, with Democrats and Republicans both making these arguments. Yet the solution cannot be for America to abandon them and cede control of them to our adversaries. As with the Cold War, the new era where the United States finds itself competing with China and Russia for influence makes international organizations a first-order issue. We must redouble our engagement and commitment to leadership. Wherever important global issues are being decided, America must have a seat at the table. Similarly, the United States must take up the battle of ideas in the court of global opinion. I commend President Biden for beginning that work, rejoining the World Health Organization, and restoring funding to key UN agencies are crucial, common-sense moves that will increase American influence around the world.
The creation of the subcommittee comes at a pivotal time. In recent years, we have seen the post-World War II international order challenged as countries like China and Russia seek to rewrite the rules in ways that advance their nationalistic agendas and undermine state sovereignty in places like Ukraine and the South China Sea. At times, there have been voices advocating for withdrawal of the United States from the international stage. I can certainly understand their frustration with the abuse of the United Nations system by malign actors. As we saw in the early stages of COVID-19, international organizations are not perfect. The World Health Organization routinely parroted Chinese Communist Party talking points that conflict with statements made by our own experts. The WHO's medical advice during the pandemic has routinely lagged behind scientific consensus. As an example, the WHO did not recommend the use of masks for the general public until June 5th, 2020, 137 days after finally confirming that COVID-19 was spreading via human-to-human transmission. In comparison, the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention here in the United States recommended masks in early April of last year. Despite widespread evidence of the CCP suppressing the genomic sequence of the virus that causes COVID-19, arresting doctors and journalists, and censoring social media discussions of the outbreak within China, Director General Tedros praised the CCP for its transparency and setting a new standard for outbreak response. The WHO's embrace of CCP propaganda directly impacted how Americans view the virus. Lawrence Gustin, a professor of global health law at Georgetown University, who also provides technical assistance to the WHO, said, "We were deceived, myself and other public health experts, based on what the World Health Organization and China were saying, reassured the public that this was not serious, that we could bring this under control. We are giving a false sense of assurance." However, I do not believe the correct response to these missteps by the WHO's is the United States to withdraw. The United Nations and international organizations more broadly are not perfect. They are consensus bodies that reflect the countries who engage with them. As such, I believe the only way the United States can push back against the behavior and fight for true reform is by having a seat at the table. At the same time, the U.S. engagement should be tempered and clear-eyed. Recently, President Biden announced that the United States will be rejoining the UN Human Rights Council and running for a seat on the council this fall. The UN Human Rights Council is a deeply flawed body with a terrible track record of protecting dictatorship and despots and covering up the crimes of the world's worst human rights abusers. Current members of the council include China, who is actively engaged in carrying out genocide against religious and ethnic majorities in Xinjiang; Russia, who has carried out nerve agent attacks on political opposition leaders like Alexei Navalny; and Venezuela, where Maduro-backed forces have killed more than 20,000 people for resistance to authority; and even countries like Cuba that have a horrible record, decades of oppression of its own people.
Our absence or lukewarm participation in multilateral organizations attracts other countries to fill that space. China has moved aggressively to provide long-term capital and uses its Belt and Road Initiative to increase its influence and to grow trade. When the US pulls back, China cheers.
With respect to China, even though its own record is checkered, to say the least, because they're investing more resources at the UN, engaging in UN bodies, active in bilateral development through initiatives like Belt and Road, their influence is rising in multilateral organizations. There's not been a takeover by any stretch, but our prior absence meant there was no effective counterweight. In fact, the Trump administration itself realized that its approach of withdrawal and withholding was not working when it appointed a special envoy to counter China's growing influence within international bodies. But it will take more than one person to fix the problem. In short, the opposite of withdrawal and withhold is engage and invest. This means no longer playing checkers while they play chess, i.e., we should increase support for the State Department and USAID, continue to rejoin key UN bodies that we walked away from, and it means paying our dues on time and paying back our arrears. Because if China and Russia are really the greatest threat to America today, as many members of this committee have stated, then our approach should follow suit, and we should counter them on every playing field that exists and marshal available resources. Of course, countering Russia and China at the UN will be most effective if the organization is fit for purpose. As former Secretary of State and U.S. Ambassador to the UN Madeleine Albright noted, and I quote, "The failure to pay our old UN bills undermines our ability to recruit allies for the kind of structural reform that Congress demands," end quote.
Our adversaries have supersized their efforts not only to best us on issues, but to hijack the whole platform. Exhibit A, the World Health Organization, which is misnamed, frankly. Instead of world, read Chinese. Instead of health, read political. And as for organization, it took over 1 year to arrange a fact-finding trip to the Wuhan laboratory, while America produced 3 vaccines in warp speed time. Today, our look at U.S. standing should not merely give itself over to foreign judgments on the United States. Rather, it needs to flag that our standing is only as good as the knowledge, skills, and abilities of Team USA in current times. Thank you. I'll resume and I'm almost finished. In recent years, the Chinese Communist Party has surmised the UN as a supersized World Trade Organization opportunity, ripe for China's plundering, hijacking, and reprogramming to its authoritarian hegemonic ambitions. Throughout, Beijing is remaining Beijing. The rest of us are learning to suffer. China is now opting for open hostility in its dialogue with us and others, as we saw this last weekend in Alaska. It is a wolf warrior diplomacy versus our UN ambassadors' self-styled gumbo diplomacy. Unless we strengthen our pot, is there any question who will be eating whose lunch in the UN cafeteria? In good form, the Biden administration has said it would continue a tough on China stance. So job one for the US mission to the UN is to organize like-minded states to face down the CCP's grab at the world order's dashboards and passwords. Another chore is the selection of the next UN Secretary General this year. A key test for candidates is managing the new moment of advancing authoritarianism upon the organization. The UN will need resilience to stem Russia's tactic to degrade and erode UN principles, and even stronger resolve to counter China's game plan to superimpose its interests over those of the UN Charter and eventually replace the spirit of openness with one of jealous authority. In closing, the US has promoted US values in force multiplying ways at the UN and other international organizations. By standing and not sitting in international organizations, the US must continue contributing to the liberal world order and further rise and champion others to defend it. Thank you very much.
Example, has the election of a Chinese national to lead the International Telecommunications Union affected global policy towards 5G, cybersecurity, or emerging technologies? I'd welcome other examples as well. I point that one out because we've been talking about how engaged the United States should be in these international organizations, whether we should vie for leadership positions, for example. And so does not being at the leadership table, not being the leader, does that make a concrete difference? I open it up to the panel.
May I speak, please?
Please.
Chairman, thank you very much for a very insightful question. Yes, it does matter who is in leadership positions throughout the organization, both among the delegations and certainly the leadership of the specialized agencies. As you rightly described, the ITU is critically involved with monitoring and establishing norms and standards of telecommunications, and 5G is central to that. There is an entire professional community that looks at this too. The stakeholders throughout civil society are multiplying on this very issue. So while the ITU has a critical role to play, it must also learn how to involve all of these other non-state actors who have real skin in the game. So yes, leadership in these organizations is going to have to be more accommodating of not just member states' participation, but reaching out to the significant stakeholders and actors who in fact have a great deal of authority in these various functional areas such as the ITU.
I could just say, I mean, you raise a great point on kind of specialized agencies, and this is a key area where we have seen China gaining influence. They now head 4 UN specialized agencies, and we had 1. And one can say quite confidently, Hugh brought up food, but one can say quite confidently that the head of the FAO is there because we were disengaged and not aligned with our allies. In addition, we know that a couple of years ago that because of cuts to the State Department, IO Bureau, that the number of people working on getting Americans at the UN was cut to 0. We had 5 and we went to 0. China makes a concerted effort to get their diplomats positions. So we need to be engaged. We certainly talked about the importance of paying arrears. And this year is incredibly important. There are 9 positions for the head of specialized agencies coming up this year, and 5 in the agency programs and funds. Hugh talked about the World Food Program. It's a great example. But this is a key year for us to be engaged and demonstrated in a variety of different ways, as I talked about. But staffing up State Department, staffing up IO, and certainly supporting payment of our dues.
I would just say quickly that from the perspective of multilateral organizations, they really are a continuum to our bilateral assistance and allow us to access the billions of dollars the multilateral agencies have in order to be able to influence the way that those resources are spent. China, as others have mentioned, is in there trying to influence these multilaterals as well, and ensuring that those resources go for areas and for factors that increase their global power.
Just Mr. Dugan, you mentioned the World Health Organization. I agree with your comments regarding that China has basically taken over this organization. Any other insight you could share with us on how we should be handling WHO going forward?
Unfortunately, we agreed to rejoin and are paying $200 million right now without establishing any consequences for bad behavior in the past. We've squandered just this last couple of weeks the opportunity and the leverage that was created by the previous administration, which in fact had put forward a very detailed reform proposal on what the WHO needed to do and publicized it widely among many of our allies, many of whom adopted it as if it were their own. Only to find the WHO ignoring it and giving us the cold shoulder throughout. So the administration gave the WHO plenty of notice and warning and incentive to come to the table. They did not. They, in fact, stalled by not even having a trip to Wuhan. I think what we need to do right now, not just as an organization, but with the pandemic, is to take our mind off of the focus on why this thing evolved where it did, and realize that the pandemic, the spread of the pandemic, is what we really need to address. There's no doubt that it spread from Wuhan, whether it originated in a lab or nearby. It's academic. It spread from Wuhan, and that is undeniable. And we need to trace that and get more accountability for that. Whether the WHO is the actor to do that, I think it's not shown itself capable, and we need to rally other resources in the world to do that for us. Thank you.
If I could just weigh in quickly here, I know there's not much time, but just because our organization does a lot with WHO, I would just like to say briefly that The WHO had made mistakes which they acknowledged. They welcome reform. There's an independent panel right now. But I do think it's clear to say there was not support for withdrawal. In fact, there was almost unanimous opposition to it. When it was announced, all the major public health associations were against the move. So was the Chamber of Commerce. Even the Heritage Foundation announced its opposition. Last July, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held a hearing on WHO and pandemic preparedness. All four witnesses, the Republican choices and the Democratic choices, were unanimous in saying that the WHO's work was needed, of critical value, and there was no appetite for some alternative. In general, I think we're more likely to see significant changes. Human rights is another perfect example. This is a clear case where the U.S. absence, China and Russia are pushing a very different narrative. And so we need to be engaged, we need to be at the table, and then we're much more likely to advance our interests. Thanks.
I just have a question about the value of the UN and how you view it. I mean, is, in your opinion, the United Nations a values neutral institution, or does it, or should it stand for things like freedom and human rights? And do you believe China's growth poses a direct threat to the rules-based liberal order that underpins the UN system? And if you could comment on that, I'd really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and for your very thoughtful question. Yes, when we talk about UN reform, thankfully nobody talks about reforming the UN Charter. It stands as a model of principle, of purpose, of respect for freedom around the world, and for the promotion of prosperity, peace and security, and human rights. So thankfully, the core principles of the UN are not in question. It's the manipulation of those principles which we have to worry about. And once again, China has invested enormously since about 15 or 20 years now in the UN. It always ignored the UN. It was afraid of the UN buying in too much and then having to let the UN into China to look at some of the things that China does that it does not want the world to see. So it's always very against any type of intervention. And even though the intervention would reveal things such as you found with the Burmese situation, abuse of human rights, etc. So it's the manipulation of the charter, of the organization, and I'm afraid almost the hijacking of the moral authority of this organization branded by China going forward that is of most concern to me. So again, we need to develop our skill set. We need to be as bright and as hardworking and take the advantages that are due us up there. Congress has a special role in managing oversight and in UN budget matters, since we are still the major contributor. Thank you.
Would you say that because, well, and toward that, you know, the UN specialized agencies, you know, the United States, Britain, and France combined only lead 4, yet China, the Chinese Communist Party, actually leads 4 itself. And would you say that's a result of manipulation in the UN, or is that something that they achieved, you know, by some kind of democratic principle to get there in that position?
Well, to be brief, they play by the rules, and they play very well and very hard. As I said, they really didn't give the UN much notion until about 15 or 20 years ago. So they've grown into their skin. They have an appropriate role. They're a large country. They make a big contribution. They represent millions and billions of people. So yes, they are playing the game better and harder than we are. Fairly, yes, by the letter, but not by the spirit.
Well, what would you suggest we do as a nation to sorry about that, I lost you. What would you say we do as a nation to combat that and to get in the game and to be the leader, since we are supposed to be the beacon of freedom around the world, to hold that order? What was your suggestion? I only have 40 seconds left, but I know Ms. McDougall wants to comment, but it's up to the chairman. So please comment if you will. Thank you.
Well, I take I'm sorry.
I'd love to hear from you both. It's up to the chairman.
Please go ahead, both of you.
Go ahead, Mr. Dugan.
Oh, I just wanted to say that the previous administration established an office in the State Department called UN Integrity, which has the writ of trying to address exactly what you're describing. It's an office that needs to be a bureau, and perhaps soon a department in the U.S. government. We need to develop more resources and expertise, as I've mentioned a few times now, to quell the onslaught of authoritarian overtake of our liberal international order.
Thank you. Ms. McDougall, I
Yeah,
think you had a comment.
I would just say that in terms of the human rights area, yes, there are governments that have consistently put forward their views about human rights being culturally based and relative to various issues and places in our politics, but they have always consistently been pushed back on those views by human rights bodies and individuals. And to the extent that there is concern about China and what violations of human rights have been done in Wuhan, in Xinjiang, to the Uyghur community. It's the CERD, the committee that I sat on, that called that out, if you will, on the international stage and started the global publicity about it and condemnation about it. So there's as much pushback as there is, positions being continuously put forward from their point of view. What we got to maintain is that we got a principled pushback that is, in those rooms, sitting in those seats.
So you agree that with Mr. Dugan that we could have an experienced, dedicated institutional voice in there to make sure that China is held accountable on human rights and other issues?
Absolutely. In this particular case, Mr. Dugan helped to run the campaign that got me that voice in that room, in that seat, to call China out about what was happening to the Uyghurs.
Thank you so much. I know my time has expired. I really appreciate all of you.
And Ms. Otero had something she wanted to add, and we've got a little bit of time here because
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a very brief addition to this. I think it's really important to recognize that China is making the case that their system works better than a democratic system that's based on a market economy. This is enormously important. They are being vocal about that, and it is basically an argument that they're putting before the world and that they are using through agencies like the UN. Our role is to be at that table and to argue that our system, our democratic values, the values of the United Nations Charter are the ones that we must uphold. And this is an issue that spans many countries in the world. And so our effort to be able to form those alliances and create those coalitions and create what you would call situations of strength within the UN is one way in which we can really push back in not only a crucial way, but I would even say in an urgent way.
During the last administration, there was an attempt to partially consolidate our competition to the Belt and Road, with recognizing that you have XM Bank, TDA, and USAID. You have a series of both in and out of the State Department agencies that are part of foreign development. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether or not that should go further, if we're going to have a U.S. united ability to bring dollars and U.S. companies and the like into successfully competing to help develop the world against what I think can only be said China's self-serving development program.
If I may answer that, thank you very much for that very thoughtful question, Congressman. And indeed, China has tried to masquerade its ambitions on Belt and Road by saying that they are fully in support and that they are tantamount to advancing the UN's strategic development goals, which is very much the Bible of UN development these days. So they're under cover of advancing those goals. They're in fact enriching their own infrastructure project around the world. Since we speak of international organizations today, we shouldn't overlook the international financial institutions among them. And China still is represented within those and considered a developing country for the sake of receiving benefits and resources and benefits of the doubt all around. So they played that very well, as I described earlier. They play within the rules, and they play them very hard. Maybe not within the spirit, but within the letter of the law. And we need to call them out when we think that they are taking advantage of the largesse and goodwill of an international liberal order that's rules-based and that assumes the best in others. I think we discovered that WTO needs a great deal of reform, as well as another organization that, and thanks to China driving a truck through the WTO, once they were allowed in, they've decided to take that big truck and back it up to the UN and load it up for Beijing. So I quite understand your question, and yes, we need to reevaluate their qualification as a developing country status within the international financial institutions, that we should not be subsidizing this grand scheme of theirs. Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Congresswoman, I might just add one other point there, and I would just say I think there's already a model that we know which works, which is countering Russia during the Cold War, and former President Reagan talked about kind of peace through strength. And so one of the things we need to do, what China has done is invested significantly in economic development, in diplomacy, and the U.S. Only spends about 1% of the federal affairs budget on diplomacy and development. Of course, we need to use our dollars wisely, but during the 1980s, we spent far more as a percentage of GDP on diplomacy and development than we do now. So that's what China is doing. We know it worked, and so we absolutely need to support additional resources for state and USAID to compete.
Well, I agree with that, and we'll continue to push for that. But I want, the question is more narrow. The Chinese intervention around the world, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is not a gift. Their programs, their development programs, are much closer to something akin to Ex-Im Bank, leveraged with maybe Trade Development Agency, because they're bringing in their companies, as you know, they're bringing in their own workers even, and they end up in many cases owning these assets, but in all cases, it's not really foreign aid in the sense of any kind of a gift, and that's where they're competing successfully against us. I'll just take one that most people don't think about. If they put in a telephone system in a developing nation, there's no question in anyone's mind that is a conduit of espionage back to Beijing. They have full transparency as to the government and private sector operations as a result. And that's separate from the large bridges, roads, and port projects that most people see, but they work hand in hand, and those programs dwarf all of our programs combined. So, and I don't think the American people are ever going to give $1 trillion in foreign aid. But the question is, can we and should we look at a program, and I'll just call it $1 trillion in potential loans and projects that are self-funding in the long run? Should that be a goal? Because right now, during the last administration, as you know, Ex-Im Bank was effectively shut down, and we were out of even the small amount of competition we'd historically done.
If I could,
All right.
thank you for that question. If I may proceed with it, there is no question that China is reaping all the benefits of the last few years of our withdrawal from working in these organizations and in these manners, and has moved forward with its own set of priorities, with its own efforts in trade, and with its own way of giving countries support at the response of countries supporting them in their own priorities, such as, for example, when they wanted to head up the Internet Intellectual Property Rights organization, they wanted total support. I think we need to remember that working through multilateral organizations, such as the World Bank and the regional banks, allows us also to be able to work with organizations that are leveraging billions of dollars from the global capital markets. And they are channeling these resources directly to the private sectors of existing developing countries. Part of our role in this work, of course, is to be able to help increase the, if you will, the punching of these multilateral organizations, in spite of the problems that they may have, and not really just rely on member contributions. The global capital markets are the big players in here because we can access enormous resources if we bring them forward. They are part of a world financial system, one that we dominate. And this is one way in which we can avoid thinking about having to put forth $1 trillion investment ourselves. We can work with other countries, and we have the structures. And it's interesting that the IFC at the World Bank or the IDB invest in the International Inter-American Development Bank. If you look at the resources that they're making available, they are one way to counter what China's doing. Second, our trade in the introduction of U.S. companies into the developing world relies on us being present, being at the table, paying our dues, and being able to open the space for them to counter the threat that China is proposing and gaining ground on.